All right, so good afternoon, everyone. So this series started 2 years ago, and we decided to provide it to you again this year. Thank you for being with us today as we begin our third year of providing these events, and we hope you will enjoy it and will develop knowledge and learn skills to be used in your vineyard and winery. I'm Dr. Aude Watrelot. I'm an assistant professor and extension specialist of enology at Iowa State University in the Department of Food Science and Human Nutrition. And I'm co-hosting this webinar with my friend and colleague, Drew Horton, a research specialist of enology at the University of Minnesota's Grape Breeding and Enology Project. So before starting the webinar, here are some instructions. Hopefully you can all see my screen correctly. So this webinar is being recorded. If you didn't participate in previous webinars those past 2 years, we have recordings that are available on YouTube. I will put the link on the chat box when we will present later today. Also, if you have any question throughout all the presentation, throughout all the webinar, please use the chat box or unmute yourself to ask the question, but wait until we are done with the presentation. And then at the end of the webinar, you will receive an email to complete a Qualtrics survey about how we did and what we would need to change for future webinar. Please take a few minutes, so 2 to 5 minutes to complete the survey at the end. So today, we will have 2 presentations, one from Klodd and one from Todd Steiner, followed by a winemaker and viticulturist panel discussion about how to manage high acidity both in the vineyards and in the cellar. Presenting first today will be Drew Horton for Klodd from University of Minnesota, because Annie had lost her voice this weekend and she cannot speak. So Drew is gonna present instead of her, and he will speak about vineyards. And that will be followed by Todd Steiner from the Ohio State University on what can be done to manage high acidity in the cellar. Then during the panel discussion, we will be joined by a vineyard management expert, Jamieson Lindquist from Cordon Vineyard Management in Minnesota, and 3 winemakers, Ben Banks from Sovereign Estate Winery in Waconia, Minnesota, and Zwink from Chankaska Creek Winery in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and John Taylor from Chankaska Creek Winery and Distillery in Kasota, Minnesota. So Drew, will you please introduce our first presenter?
I will. Annie Klodd, an assistant extension professor at the University of Minnesota, is a statewide university extension services provider for fruit and vegetable production. She works with farmers across Minnesota to deliver research-based guidance on growing fruit and vegetable crops. She manages the University of Minnesota Extension Fruit and Vegetable Newsletter, and she co-hosts the Cold Climate Fruit webinar series with the University of Minnesota and colleagues from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Annie grew up on a vineyard in Iowa and holds a master's degree in plant biology from Penn State University. And Annie, I would invite you to start your presentation, but as we mentioned earlier to you participants, unfortunately, Annie has lost her voice and has a sore throat, and so I have volunteered to step up and present, to narrate her presentation. And I'll pull this up right now, and there it is. And can you all see that?
Can you make it in full screen? Yep, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. All right, so this is Drew Horton, managing wine acidity. Hold on here. I have to move that there we go. Managing wine acidity starts in the vineyard by Annie Klodd, University of Minnesota Extension educator, fruit production. In this presentation, we'll be talking about how various vineyard practices can impact wine acidity and how this can be managed. And for some reason, it won't forward. Hold on a moment. There we go. So as the grapes in the vineyard move past veraison, or in French, veraison, so as the grapes move past veraison and toward ripening, they accumulate sugars and anthocyanins and undergo changes in nutrient content and berry structure. During this process, the berries become less acidic and more sweet. Their pH increases by roughly one whole unit, and titratable acidity decreases significantly, while Brix increases significantly. Generally speaking, berries with lower titratable acidity and higher pH will make lower acid wines. A perhaps less obvious predictor of wine acidity is the potassium content of the berry. And while it's well studied in research, many grape growers and winemakers may not be fully aware that the amount of potassium in the berry can also determine the acidity of the wine. So how does this work? Well, it turns out grape skins are sinks for potassium. In other words, the skins accumulate a lot of potassium as the berries ripen. Potassium is an important nutrient for grapevines, helping enable shoot and fruit growth throughout the season. It also enables proper fruit ripening in the latter part of the season. However, there can be too much of a good thing. Under certain circumstances, the berry skins can accumulate too much potassium, and this excess potassium in the berry skins can cause free acids like tartaric acid to precipitate out during the first few days of fermentation. And the result of this is a must and a wine with a high pH. Researchers have found that even if grapes are harvested at the correct pH range, excessive potassium can still raise the wine pH to unacceptable levels during fermentation. This illustration from Penn State shows just how much the grape skins accumulate of potassium. As you can see in the picture, the concentration of potassium in the skin is much higher than in the pulp or the seeds. Therefore, excessive potassium is a more significant problem for red wines that are fermented with the skins, but this is less of a concern for white wines. Excess potassium is a common problem, with Penn State extension specialists reporting more calls from growers about excessive potassium than deficient potassium. In general, a concentration of 50 millimoles per liter is considered excessive. Not many growers have their potassium content measured, but there is a lab test available for growers who want to know this, who want to measure this. Now that we know how grape acidity and potassium content impact wine acidity, let's talk about ways to manage it. The vineyard practices affecting potassium levels are closely tied with the practices that impact grape pH and acidity, so we'll be talking about them together. Several different vineyard management practices can be tweaked or adjusted to make small changes in wine acidity. The good news is that you may be already doing most of these things, as they are widely recommended for maintaining overall vine health anyway. Factors impacting acidity include sun exposure to the clusters, fruit load, fertilizer inputs or soil nutrient availability, harvest timing, and variety selection. Let's talk about cluster sun exposure first. Researchers have found that more shaded clusters tend to be more acidic. They ripen more slowly, and therefore pH increases more slowly than on clusters exposed to more sunlight. Likewise, potassium is generally higher in more shaded clusters, sometimes to excessive levels. However, the mechanism behind that is not well understood. While it is healthy for clusters to have some level of shade, aim for a balance so they can ripen properly. I know from my California experience that vineyard managers would always talk about dappled sunlight, that every cluster at some point during the day would have some sun exposure and maybe some shade as well, but certainly not 100% of the time in shade. That little note is a personal addendum. There are several ways to manage the amount of shading on clusters. This can be done through proper canopy management, including dormant pruning, shoot thinning, and mid-season leaf removal. Additionally, avoid nitrogen fertilization unless a deficiency is present, since nitrogen promotes vegetative growth and can lead to an overly large canopy. For those of you who wish to be even more precise with their canopy management, you could even leave more canopy on the south and west sides of the rows where the vines get hit by direct sunlight in the afternoon, and leave less on the north and east sides. We're not going to cover dormant pruning here, but we will give a refresher on shoot thinning. Right now is the time of the season to shoot thin, while the shoots are tender enough to remove by hand. A general guideline for shoot thinning is to thin down to 2 shoots per spur, or 6 or 7 shoots per linear foot. Remove any extras, selecting shoots for removal that are less fruitful or weaker. If possible, keep shoots that are closer to the base of the spur. Sorry. If possible, keep shoots that are closer to the base of the spur to manage spur creep over time. Thin when shoots are between 4 to 11 inches long. Leaf removal is a common practice in most wine-growing regions, but many Midwest vineyards still do not practice consistent leaf removal from year to year. It is time-consuming, but helps greatly to improve airflow and sun exposure. The best time to do leaf removal is when the berries are between bloom and pea-sized. Waiting too long to remove leaves can shock the berries and cause them to be sunburned. Another way to help manage acidity is to make fertilizer decisions based on soil and foliar nutrient tests. Since nutrient dynamics can impact pH, especially potassium, aim for sufficient nutrition to meet the vine's needs without adding unnecessary extras. Soil specialists generally recommend doing a routine soil test every 3 to 5 years in either the spring or the fall. If you suspect a nutrient deficiency based on leaf symptoms or lack of vine vigor, you can take a soil test whenever you suspect a problem. Foliar or leaf tissue tests should be taken every year, either at bloom or at veraison. If you are diagnosing a problem like leaf discoloration, you can take a foliar test at any time, but this test must include at least 2 samples, one for the problem leaves and one for the healthy leaves for comparison. If your test reports state that nutrient levels are high, do not add foliar or soil amendments. Only add amendments for the nutrients that are deficient. This chart from the University of Minnesota Extension website should be used to help you interpret your soil test results. It shows the concentration of each nutrient that are considered low, medium, high, and excessive for grapevines. In terms of managing wine acidity, it's especially important to prevent excessive potassium. Excess potassium additions in the vineyard may lead to elevated grape must pH and instability as discussed earlier. Remember that more is not always better when it comes to potassium. Aim for adequate but not extreme potassium levels. Preventive application of potassium, when foliar test results show adequate potassium already, are not helpful and can do more harm than good. This table from the University of Minnesota Extension website shows how to interpret soil tests for potassium in several fruit crops. The website also includes a table for interpreting foliar test reports. Last but not least, harvest your grapes at recommended ranges for pH and titratable acidity. The Growing Grapes in Minnesota Guide has a table adapted from Dr. Tony Wolf's publication showing the recommended pH and TA ranges for various types of grapes and wine. For specific pH and TA ranges for University of Minnesota varieties, those are listed here. The ranges listed on the previous slide are published in a series of fact sheets for each variety. We are working on adding more varieties to this series, including the Plocker varieties, the Crimson Pearl and Petite Pearl and Verona. Last but not least, the information in this presentation came from, well, it came from Annie Klodd, of course, but it came from the following peer-reviewed studies and research-based extension resources. You can find these links by emailing Annie Klodd if you would like to read more yourself. And once again, all credit goes for this wonderful presentation to Annie Klodd. So thank you, Annie, and hope you get better soon.
Thank you, Drew and Annie, for your great presentation, both of you. As a reminder to everybody who is attending, please type any question you may have in the chat box. You can also use the Q&A box, but that would be easier for us if you can use only the chat box. And we will answer those questions through the roundtable with everybody. So I'm gonna introduce the next presenter, Todd Steiner, and I will make him the next presenter. So give me just a minute. So Todd Steiner has been with the Ohio State University OARDC 33 years and has been the leader of the Enology program since 2001. He serves as the state enologist outreach specialist to the Ohio commercial wine industry. His main extension responsibilities include co-organizing the annual Ohio Grape and Wine Conference, the annual Ohio Wine Competition, organizing workshops, performing winery site visits, and being a feature presenter at both in-state and out-of-state meetings and webinars. Recently, he has developed several large programmatic efforts to answer the growing wine industry in Ohio. Todd has been honored to judge in numerous regional, national, and international wine competitions within the United States. He has previously served several terms on the board of directors for the American Society of Enology and Viticulture Eastern Section. Todd, we are ready for your presentation.
All right, thanks, Ode. I certainly appreciate it, and it was a pleasure to have Ode as a featured speaker at our annual Grape and Wine Conference this past year. So it's an honor to be here, and I think I'll just share my screen and see if I can get this PowerPoint up for you.
Mm-hmm.
And let's see here. Can you see that all right?
Nope.
Nope, Todd.
We don't see anything.
Oh, let me see what's going on here. Hold on. Let's try this button, see if that works.
There you go.
All right.
Yeah.
But that just shows your sort of your open browser page. Here we go.
There
you go.
Good.
You're good.
Okay. Sounds good. Hey, thanks again. It's a pleasure to be here, and you know, I was pleased to when I got asked by Ode to present at this webinar series on acid management of must and wine. And you know, it's great to follow a good presentation from Annie Klodd through Drew there and all her good information about how we handle acid management in the vineyard, because I really think that that's critical in you know, how we proceed in the cellar then. And hopefully we don't have to do as much in the cellar because of what we've done in the vineyard to help us out. So, and that would go to make sure that we have good, clean fruit, which is most important coming in as well. So just a little thing here, just a you know, a special thanks again to acknowledgement for ISU and University of Minnesota on their research and winemaking webinar series. And also those who are attending. I mean, it's you guys are busy in the vineyard and the cellar, and you know, it's good to see people that are interested in furthering their knowledge in grape and wine practices, you know, through these webinars that are organized by Ode and Drew and his efforts. So I do want to thank the Ohio Grape Industries Committee for supporting our viticulture and enology research at Ohio State University. So without them, without them, it wouldn't be possible to do what we do. So just to try to stay on schedule as much as I can. I've got a lot of information, so I thought this might be good to include if it's going to be posted somewhere. So some of this I'll cover more briefly than others, but this is just kind of a quick outline. We're going to look at you know, acidity and its impact a little bit on sensory evaluation. But also looking at either, you know, depending how it comes in chemistry wise into the cellar, the grapes, and whether or not it will, you know, serve for acid addition or acid reduction methods. So the major acids that we find in grape and or must in wine are tartaric acid and malic acid. Both these are fixed acids. And really, they account for over 90% of the total acids that we find in juice. Citric acid can be found at much smaller levels. It is also a fixed acid. However, we have acids that are derived from fermentation or microbial derived. And we find that with lactic acid. Obviously, that would be acid that we you know, convert during the malolactic process. Or that's the product that we convert through the malolactic process. Succinate is an acid that is created by yeast, and certain species of yeast can create more succinic than others. So there could be a situation where we might find that through fermentation we've had an increase in acid. Well, and it could be related to increase in succinic acid by certain yeast strains that we might be utilizing there. The other volatile acid or acetic acid, we find more through yeast can produce it, as well as bacteria, more specifically Acetobacter, and that's why we have to analyze for that, since there's legal limits on that. But all of these acids, the fixed and the volatile acids, you know, they add up to a wine's total acidity. And really, the titratable acidity represents a portion of the total acidity, somewhere in the range around 70% of that total acidity. So acidity, and why is it good or beneficial to monitor and maintain? It's responsible for wine freshness, tartness, crisp taste that we achieve. You know, really, it also directly correlates to the longevity of a wine and how long it's going to be shelf stable too. So we also need acidity to carry fruit flavors longer on the palate for better sensory perception. But we can have wines that are too high in acidity and they appear, you know, very tart or puckery, whereas the opposite, if it's too low, it may be flat or insipid. So we want all these things in synergy and balance. You know, that's a good thing to monitor. Now, obviously, acidity is associated with particular varieties. You know, certain varieties carry known acidities or what we would expect for optimum harvest times. Also, different wine styles. We've already heard from Annie through Drew that vintage soil conditions, cultural practices received, these all play a vital role in the acid management and acid levels that are coming into the cellar. So, you know, there's other, you know, it has a sensory perception, but it also associates with the concentration of other components. So it could be sugar, the sugar acid ratio, could be alcohol has a perceived sweetness. Tannin can, you know, as we increase bitterness or astringency, can kind of heighten that acidity factor. So it all depends on the wine matrix, and that's good to keep in mind. Each year and each vintage can be a little different. So, but in my mind, it's better just to have a wine that's properly balanced. I always speak about balance a lot where I go, and especially in the sugar to acid ratio, because I think it's going to express fruit longer on the palate, as well as appeal to most consumers, most palates that come in the door, instead of just answering either a sweet or dry consumer. I think we'll approach more palates that way, and it'll be a better, well-made wine that enhance other attributes also. However, we should not really base TA and influence of acids on taste alone. Really need to pay attention to pH, as we heard through Annie's presentation too, when adjusting acidity. The only problem is there's really no clear or linear correlation. We have kind of theoretical views or additions of certain, say, chemical adjectives that we're going to add to adjust acidity, but it really depends on the buffering complex of the wine and how complex the wine is. So also depends on different acid concentrations, how much tartaric we have in there, how much malic. And it's always best to perform bench trials from the theoretical values to know what the actual results are, and then carry it through into the cellar. But really, monitoring juice and wine pH is important to help determine the ripeness of the grape, color stability of the must and wine, as well as, maybe more importantly, the chemical and microbial stability. And these are true, really vital components to pay attention to. I look at them a lot when we determine optimum harvest times, whether or not we need to, we feel something might be breaking down because of increased pH, a concern with rain coming, then we might want to take it a little bit early. So pH plays a real big role in determining optimum harvest parameters and when we want to harvest. I'm not going to cover this a lot because it'll be on the slide that you can peruse through at a more convenient time, maybe for you, to go into the differences on pH and TA, other than to say basically pH is a measurement of acidity or alkalinity, or more specifically, kind of measures the strength of the total acid content. Whereas TA is those that are available to bond to a strong base or be neutralized by a strong base, the hydrogen ions in solution. And more specifically, or importantly, it's advisable to have must pH, at a target range below 3.5 prior to primary fermentation. And then I would say prior to cold stabilization, shoot for that magical number of 3.65. So try to be below that prior to cold stabilization. Bolton, I like this slide because Bolton classified kind of acidity and pH conditions that we tend to see coming into the cellar. And we have low TA and high pH. That may be a wine that's coming from a warm climate region. I'm not sure the regulations on where people are from. If you can purchase, fruit from out of state, maybe it's from California. This could be a common situation and would be, a good situation for tartaric acid addition. We have moderate TA and pH. This is kind of the ideal situation and where we want to shoot for. If we can have this situation coming into the cellar at harvest time, this is ideal where we would like to be. So we don't have a lot of manipulation that we need to do. And, that can be a good thing. So, but many times we have in cool climate or cold climate regions, we have high TA and a low pH. So there's more ability to be able to perform here. So we can either do chemical deacidification. We can go through natural deacidification with malolactic fermentation. We can do blending, sugar addition, acid reducing yeast strains. So those are all at our disposal that we can potentially utilize and maybe together in this type of situation. Then we can have a high TA and a high pH, and that's more problematic. And hopefully we take care of things in the vineyard that we don't necessarily have this situation from happening. But if we do, we can look at certain ways to handle that, and that might be just through calcium carbonate. Looking at acid addition, again, just to kind of stay more on time. I'm not going to mention that a whole lot because I think most of the people, I don't want to assume a lot, but most of the people probably on this webinar coming from cool climate or cold climate regions where this is not always the problem. In Ohio, though, we do have years, great vintage years, where we do have to add acid, and that can be a good thing. So, but tartaric acid would be the acid of choice. It's a stronger acid with a greater pH reduction than either citric or malic. Plus the fact that citric and malic can be metabolized by other microorganisms, so it can be a further concern down the road for some off byproducts being formed. Anytime we have a large acid addition needed, we would recommend it to the mustard or the juice, and then we can just fine tune to the wine, and that could even be through blending or something like that. This is just a blending formula for increasing juice titratable acidity. You can look through at a more convenient time. This just states that, yes, the tartaric acid is the stronger and preferred acid. We can use other acids, but we have to take into consideration that it could be microbially utilized, and it does make the use of proper SO2 and sterile filtration vitally important down the road. So something to keep in mind, using tartaric acid, we see kind of a theoretical addition rate of 1 gram per liter will yield, or 3.8 grams per gallon will yield about a increase in TA of about 0.1%. This is just an example of how to calculate the addition of tartaric acid. However, in most cases in cool climate, as I mentioned, cold climate regions, really excess acidity tends to be what we deal with more often coming into the cellar. So Annie did a great job on explaining some ways to help manage that or control that, and that's vital coming in. But if they do come in higher than desired on acidity, then we would look at a number of different ways to handle it. So one would be amelioration. Another would be chemical neutralization or precipitate of tartrates, choosing an acid-reducing yeast strain, malolactic fermentation, blending, sugar addition. All these are certainly at our disposal to utilize. I'm not going to mention ion exchange or electrodialysis using specific membrane technology, although that can be effective, but usually that's fairly costly for that technology, as well as most only real large wineries are typically utilizing that to that extent. When we look at amelioration, this is really for a must that has a moderate TA and pH. And it's common in cool climate winemaking regions where we contain insufficient sugar and excess acidity. Maybe in cold climate we have excess sugar and excess acidity. We could still use amelioration here to help reduce the TA and lower the sugar content to a more acceptable level for making it a good or accessible for yeast to do their job, not create a stress factor. So we can implement that. It really hasn't been recommended typically for premium quality wines. I would say more in a vinifera style, some select hybrid, more so on the white than maybe the red, because it may have an impact on reduction of aroma, flavor, color, and varietal characteristics. We tend to see it more for Labrusca style varieties, and it does a great job for that because these are pretty strong in aromatic or flavor potential compounds. And we can see it also in high acid, high brix, cold climate selections, as I mentioned. We do see it for those that can get fruit, from out of state, maybe from California or a real warm climate or a warm vintage, where the we have a high sugar content and low acid. We can ameliorate with tartaric acid in there and bring that up to acceptable levels while we're dropping the sugar content also. We just want to pay attention to TTB legal limits on amelioration, and that link or site is there. This is just a percent how to calculate the percent amelioration needed for reducing must titratable acidity. Now, if we have a must that does have high TA and low pH, so somewhere in the range of 8 to 10 grams per liter, maybe pHs of 3.0 or 3.1, somewhere in that range or below, we would recommend chemical deacidification can be effective, and the theoretical addition rate would be somewhere right around 0.9 grams per liter will reduce the TA about 1 gram per liter. Again, depends on the buffering capacity on the wine, but anytime we have large additions that are recommended, I would say do it to the juice or clarified juice, and just fine tune to the wine. That's a better approach, and will have less effect on aromatic compounds that way too. Some of the advantages, disadvantages of using potassium bicarbonate. Advantages we see, well, they're naturally occurring in wine. So we have potassium ions, bitartrate anion, and they can form the potassium bitartrate upon cold stabilization techniques. So that's pretty efficient. And we can utilize potassium bicarbonate with other deacidification procedures like a malic acid reducing yeast strain, malactic fermentation, amelioration. There's different options there that we can utilize. Some of the disadvantages, it's really not effective in high acid musts or wines if we want to reduce the acidity to a greater extent without a concern for raising our pH excessively. So that can be problematic. And if we're wanting too much of a drop in acid, then calcium carbonate would probably be a better way to go. And it does require cold stabilization. So these are wines that you need to allow. They can't be wines you're trying to push through too early to bottle. So we do have to go through the cold stabilization process or use alternative methods for that to help. However, if we have a situation where we have a high TA, must or juice with a high TA and a high pH, so a little more problematic. So we're looking at TAs above 9 grams per liter, acid adjustments greater than 2 grams per liter. It's really a good idea to have individual acid profiles. So, what is our tartaric acid content? What is the malic acid content? Kind of tells us a little bit more how it's going to behave. But the addition rate, again, is about 0.67 grams per liter. Will reduce the TA by about 1 gram per liter. So again, large acid reductions are recommended to the must or juice. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily calcium carbonate into the wine because it can have a big effect on flavor profile as well. So could be that if we're just fine tuning, you might want to go with potassium bicarbonate or maybe another deacidification method like blending or something like that, which is often underutilized. Some of the advantages and disadvantages, provides a maximum reduction in TA with a minimal increase in pH. We're still going to increase pH, so it's good to know where we are. There isn't any cooling required for the precipitation of calcium tartrate or calcium malate. So, that's nice, but it comes with a caveat too. It is mentioned to remove malic acid, but really at a pH ranging in about 4.5 to 6.5. And that's kind of as a technique we may have heard of as the double salt procedure. Some of the disadvantages of calcium carbonate, it is slow. Calcium tartrate is slow to precipitate, even though cooling's not required. Typically somewhere 6 to 8 weeks, I would advise, if not longer, because it is unpredictable. Potassium ions in juice, we were talking about excess potassium. They can interfere with calcium carbonate reactions and make it insufficient. Plus the fact that if we have too much calcium carbonate, we can raise the pH to an unacceptable level where we're more concerned about microbial or chemical stability, and we can introduce a salty or soapy taste as well. So just kind of quick, the quick procedure of this, the double salt deacidification that we would use. Used to be known really with a compound called Acidex. However, it's my understanding that this compound's no longer being created, and I don't believe that TTB even allows this anymore as well as an additive into wine. But similar results have been reported just with use of calcium carbonate alone and monitoring the pH. I believe some of this initial work came from Thomas Hennekling, actually when he was at Cornell. But watching or monitoring must and wine pH is pretty critical for the formation of calcium malate and calcium tartrate. And it's just good to know that it mostly takes out tartrate unless our concentration of the malic acid is considerably higher. And by that, I would probably mean like maybe double of that of tartaric acid. So we would just take a portion of the must, 20 to 40% of the tank to be treated, and we would slowly add that to the calcium carbonate as far as the procedure goes with continuous mixing, and that's critical, it has to be continuously agitated while monitoring pH. So pH from 4.5 to 6.5, which will help precipitate out the tartrates of calcium and malate. You know, the real true talk of the double salt was dealing with calcium mallotartrate forms, and that actually, there's some question is whether or not that actually does form. But regarding that, if we're at those pH levels, we do see a result in a greater TA reduction with a lower pH shift. So it can be good to utilize. Using a malic acid reducing yeast strain certainly has viability and is a great thing to utilize. These just happen to be Lalamon strains that I've used in our research lab or research cellar. And I would have to say the exotics I've been pretty pleased with over the years. I know Lalvin C has shown good reduction as well. But it may reduce in general anywhere from 15 to 30% malic acid. We've heard about Schizosaccharomyces pombe, which is an encapsulated yeast, encapsulated in alginate, or otherwise known as promalic. That's been effective in reducing malic acid, where we add that in a nylon bag. And here's where it's I would say it's beneficial or critical to know your malic acid content and kind of monitor that over some time here while that's submerged in the juice or must. And then when we see a reduction that we're pleased in of malic acid, then we would want to remove that, add a desired Saccharomyces commercial strain that will take over or dominate that fermentation because Schizosaccharomyces pombe does have poor alcohol tolerance, and just like that or any other wild yeast, anytime we have a stress factor in there, we could produce some off flavors and aromas that we would not want in our wine. So it's good to get a strain in there that's going to dominate that and take over with more known fermentation kinetics and profiles. So we can also do malolactic fermentation. That's where we just simply degrade L-malic acid to L-lactic acid and carbon dioxide. And basically the strain of interest would be the Enococcus eni strain. It's not really a true fermentation as there's little energy produced in the form of CO2, but just known pinpoint, those pronounced pinpoint bubbles that we would tend to see. And we can really see a reduction of acidity, roughly, depending again on the concentration of acids and malic acid, reduction of 1 to 3 grams per liter. So the chemistry behind that, we just see, we start with malic acid, which is a stronger acid, where our Enococcus eni can utilize to develop carbon dioxide and lactic acid, which is a weaker acid, has one carboxyl group. It can be very beneficially in naturally reducing or deacidifying our wine. And it also adds complexity too. So whether it's through diacetyl or whether it's through releasing fruit aromas from grape precursors, It's also been known to reduce unripe or vegetal flavors. Now, this would be dependent on specific strains or the timing of inoculation. Are we performing co-inoculation or sequential? So that can have some differences on how those concentrations of aroma compounds through malolactic fermentation would be created, or in what threshold. So it also creates a wine that's more microbial stable. So since microbes can utilize L-malic acid, if we take that out of the equation, then that wine's going to be more stable. That doesn't mean that we can be less that we can have less SO2 in there. We still need to have SO2 in there because microbes can use other wine components or attributes to produce off byproducts. So paying attention to SO2 and pH is certainly critical, as well as sterile filtration. I think blending is often underutilized. I've mentioned this before, that it's a great way to reduce wine acidity and further aid to complexity of the wine. So, we would hope that we're looking to further increase quality attributes of that final blend beyond what we have in the two initial wines that we want to improve. So it's good just to note that cold stabilization should be done after these blending trials, because we are changing the wine chemistry, and we needed to make sure that it's cold stable prior to putting it in the bottle. This is just a Pearson square that we can utilize to calculate, our blending ratios in starting with the original wines and develop and have a target that we want to get to. And then, the last thing is sugar addition. So, we all know the power of a little sugar. It balances that acid ratio. We can have a wine that's fairly high in acid, but just balancing it with the right amount of sugar, not over cloying or anything by that means. Just balancing it right, can really bring out fruit structure too, while kind of taming the acid structure, kind of bring everything together in synergy. And it can definitely help fruit and aroma or flavor attributes too. So, these are all added things that we have at our disposal, that we can help manage acidity in the winery and also pay attention to pH as well. So with that, kind of a quick way of going through acid management in the cellar, but I guess we're going to have time for discussions. And so if I close out of see if I stop sharing my screen.
Thanks, Todd. Great.
Open that up to panel, I guess.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Todd, for your wonderful presentation about how to manage acidity in your cellar. And I hope you have some questions, you attendees. If you have questions, please use the chat box to type them. I do have just a quick question for you, Todd. When you were mentioning fixed acidity at the beginning of your presentation, you said that tartaric acid and malic acid, they are fixed acids. What do you mean by fixed? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry about that. They don't change. They're fixed in concentration, but like in the case of malic or citric, they can be utilized by microorganisms, where tartaric generally is not. So that's kind of what we mean by that.
Yep. Good. Thank you. I'm just checking if we have some comments or question. I see, and hopefully you can all see on the chat box, that Drew, you share the recent results from Itasca about the pH that is as high as 3.35 and a TA as low as 6.5 grams per liter with a Brix of 24.5. So if you don't see that in the chat box, that's just to give you some ideas about Itasca. The white grapes.
We were very glad to see that. because those numbers are darn near like vinifera. Of course, that was last season, 2021, which was probably the one of the greatest even vintages, longest and even vintages we've ever had in Minnesota. Um, without any further question, are there any other questions there, Ode? I was just going to say that
No other question for the moment.
okay, well, we haven't asked these other viticulturalists and winemakers here just to answer Q&A. We're hoping to open up to a panel discussion. I've got some questions to ask if none of our participants do. So as mentioned earlier, we'll now be joined by Jamieson Lindquist from Grand Cordon Vineyard Management in Lonsdale, Minnesota, and winemakers Ben Banks from Sovereign Estates Winery in Waconia, Minnesota, Ann Zwink from Soldier Creek Winery in Fort Dodge, Iowa, and John Taylor from Chankaska Creek Ranch Winery and Distillery in Kasota, Minnesota. We're very fortunate to have so many experienced viticulturalists and winemakers here to discuss the subject of high acidity, which is really, in my mind, a combination of techniques and methods that can and should be used when working with many of these higher acid, lower pH grapes we have here in the greater Midwest and Northeast. And I'll ask again, Ode, do we have any questions in from our participants?
We do have one from Eric. What percentage of your wines are you chemically reducing acidity versus blending with low acid varieties versus adding, leaving residual sugar?
Any one of you winemakers can answer that.
There's a lot to unpack there. I would say that for us, roughly about 30 to 35% of the wines that we make every year by volume, not by product, but by volume, are going to be adjusted by leaving some residual sugar. We use a number of methods, blending chief among them, to achieve buffering capacity, if you will, and trying to achieve, I'm really glad Todd said this, a balance point in the wine. And so roughly another 30 to 35% of the fruit that we make every year comes from the West Coast to allow us that opportunity to do some blending. And then we use a number of techniques in the winery. We do very little water addition or amelioration. Lots of stem inclusion in pretty much almost all of our red fruit in Minnesota is mechanically harvested. So instead of just stemming it, I just pump it right into a tank. You got to be working with your growers and knowing what you're getting. But for us, the vast majority of the fruit that we get every year is clean, and the stem inclusion, I think, really provides a nice balance point for both the tannin extraction to help, again, buffer some of that, as well as maybe get some additional chemistry by having that stem.
I have a quick follow-up, real quickly, both to Ann Zwink and Ben Banks. Maybe you can just give approximate percentages, how many wines you will adjust, either blending versus sweetening, or do you do a little bit of both sometimes?
Yeah, for me, I'm just looking at my notes here. I am kind of an acid enthusiast, and I like it. So my approach is actually to embrace it. And I have only used, potassium bicarbonate in the worst years. Looking at 2021, I didn't use it at all. For example, Marquette came in at, 0.88 grams per liter. Itasca was at, 0.75. So we had very low acidity those years. And my main approach is, malolactic and cold stabilization. That's really my main approach to deacidification for me. In some bad years, I have used potassium, potassium bicarbonate, and I would say about 30% of our wine has residual sugar to balance.
And Anne, what's your input there?
I kind of agree with Ben. We tend to embrace the acidity, and 100% of our wines are Midwestern fruits, so we don't have the luxury of balancing with vinifera. So yeah, I would say we do have a lot of residual. We do leave a lot of residual sugar, but agreeing with Ben, 2021 was not one of the years for that, so it was definitely one of the years that we would embrace our drier wines, and we just try and make more volume of dry wines in the years that the climate allows. I've used potassium carbonate one time very early on, and then the year following that I used calcium carbonate. That was probably 2014 and 2015, which were both very wet years for us. I'm not gonna lie, I didn't love it. I know that some people think it's a good option for them, but I just felt like after that, after those two attempts, I would prefer just to keep the wine and juice as they are. And we will use a lot of malolactic also.
You didn't like it because it was bringing some of flavors, or for other reasons?
It didn't, well, I probably did it wrong. So it didn't seem to work in the way that I had hoped. And that was with the potassium. And then after trying the calcium, it did reduce quite a bit, but it seemed to mute. It definitely muted. I used it on La Crescent, and it was a muted year of La Crescent aromas. So that was a sadness for me.
Yeah.
I'd rather blend. We will do some blending too, but I wouldn't say that the blending that we do is to achieve acid balance. It's more to achieve aromatic interest.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I'll follow up. I have never used calcium or potassium carbonate in the 5 vintages that I've been in the upper Midwest.
And I see a good question from Alex about changing consumer demand.
Yep.
And I know that since 2010, which is when I started, we've always focused on dry wines, and maybe 1 or 2 wines per vintage had sweetness to them. That seems to work for us because we're pretty close to the cities. From what I heard for people who are farther away from the cities, the sweeter wines are still dominant. So I think it does depend on your location. But I know for us, staying consistent was the best thing so that people understood who we were as a winery.
I think we should probably talk about sparkling too, where it's like, where you are looking for that acidity in sparkling. Sparkling is starting to become more popular too in the Midwest, which is good.
What do you think, Anne, about the customer or consumer demand about the acidity?
Ben, I think you've hit it spot on. I think, we're pretty rural Iowa, Northwest Iowa, and I think Southwest Minnesota might be kind of similar. Our customers, we're just far enough away that our customers definitely ask for sweet. And we do make dry, but it's not nearly the same volume. It's probably the opposite, 1/3 dry and 2/3 sweetened. And I do find though that people are, they're changing a little bit over time, but I don't know if they're necessarily changing because of acidity or just because, just interest in trying something new.
All right, so of my top 5 wines that account for 75% of our production, 2 of them are bone dry reds. One is a semi-sweet rosé, one is a sweet white wine, and one is an off-dry white wine. So and all five of those are our top five, both here direct at the winery as well as in our distribution channel as well. So we're really seeing it not just in our mini metro. Casota's just outside of Mankato, and we've got about 150 to 160,000 within 15-mile radius of the winery. But you're going to see some of those outsiders that want the sweet. You're going to see some people in the metro want sweet, and so we see a combination. I think that the market in the Midwest has certainly changed since I've gotten here in 2017 to some degree. But is it an earth-shattering change? Probably not, but there has definitely been a shift in the market.
Excellent. We have
We
another
Yeah, we do have a question, and I have a personal question.
Go ahead, Ode.
So the question we have from Alex again: does everyone produce a sparkling? Charmat, traditional, Asti methods? Would you like to expand?
And I'm going to jump in here and just say, Alex, John Taylor, and Chankaska Creek just took the Governor's Cup at the International Cold Climate Wine Competition for their sparkling Frontenac Gris, Frontenac Blanc blend. And that is a traditional method or method traditional produced sparkling wine. But I think both Anne and Ben, you have both have some experience in sparkling. Why don't we talk about that all a little bit?
Well, I can start. Right now, the only sparkling I'm doing for sale is done carbonically. Just in a bright tank and bottled under pressure. At this point in the year, this spring, it is everyone's favorite wine, and it is the bane of my existence because it sells out. I can only make 60 cases at a time, and they sell out every couple of weeks. So it's a struggle to keep up, and the plan is to add Charmat to our production. I do agree that the grapes we grow here are perfectly suited for sparkling wine, and the demand is going up for that for sure. I've done a Frontenac Blanc with Method Traditional that has been very well received. It was just a small test batch. We just don't have the cellar space to pull that off. So for us, we're going to go Charmat, and probably with Frontenac Blanc and or Itasca. We'll see.
We're also only 100% forest carb on our bubbly. I don't think that in our area, it's, again, the rural area, it's not our best seller, but it is starting to gain some traction, I think, again, with the summer. I think that, yeah, I don't know. I don't have anything to add about it, really.
I will say this about Minnesota sparkling season, at least. It is completely non-traditional. Your typical sparkling season starts to ramp up as the holidays start approaching and into the end of the year, and then they drop off like a cliff. Our sparkling season has just started with our patio season. People really want a ice cold bucket of bubbles and listen to music and enjoy the weather that is a Minnesota summer. And so we will see, oh goodness, we'll see a 6-fold increase from May until September in our sparkling sales monthly compared to the winter. And so I inherited a traditional method system, and we made the decision last year fortuitously to acquire a gyro pallet, an automated riddling machine. So instead of being able to do 300 bottles every 2 weeks by hand, we're now doing 504 bottles every 5 to 7 days. So we have had to put a spot in the cellar to kind of dedicate to that machine, but it has allowed us to stay on top of our demand, which has been a great boon to our bottom line. And from a grape quality standpoint, you're picking anywhere from late August through the first 2 weeks of September, and your sparkling season is done. So it is kind of nice to have that flexibility.
Yeah, I would kind of agree with everybody here. I mean, mainly talking about, and I would lump cool climate in there as well, which would be, Ohio and a lot of the eastern section. But cold climate varieties are ideal for sparkling wine production. You have that acidity already. You may likely don't even have to whole cluster press. I mean, because that's some of the reason why we whole cluster press when we're dealing with wines that don't have quite as much acidity. We want to retain as much acidity as possible. So that's one way we will retain more acidity. So, great. I also like to hear everybody talking about consistency. And I think that's important in wine quality when we're looking at acid management, but also other attributes that lead to sensory perception. So, that consumer consistency from year to year, that's what people are looking for. And, I always mention, because we do have some cold climate varieties in certain parts of the state, is that don't make a variety something that it's not supposed to be. So, create that variety and what it brings to the table. Yeah, we can do things in the vineyard, as we've heard, and the cellar, but make sure that it's a balanced wine, and don't make that variety something that it's not supposed to be. That's why I really like the Tasca. I remember when that first came around, Matthew Clark brought that down to ASCV. We had a meeting, and right there's a great drier style wine that can be produced more on a consistent basis. And I know there's others, from your great breeding programs up there that are in the works too. So, those are all good things.
Good, thank you. And so I have a question about the management of potassium. Does anybody look at the amount of potassium in the grapes that they use to make wine, or not really?
I don't have the capability.
Yeah, neither do I. And I usually don't send stuff out either.
Do you guys test for nitrates at all either, or do like yeast some symbol nitrogen or anything like that?
Theoretically, that is part of a that we'll be adding in here, but we haven't been doing that consistently.
And you've got a spec in your lab. Do you ever do your own yan?
Yep, I do all my own yan.
Yep, you're very diligent. I remember that about you.
Well, I've had enough problems, so
Yeah,
to me it's worth it.
real quick question for the three winemakers, and have either of you tried on any kind of scale the double salt method as Todd described?
I believe I tried it once on a batch of Saval Blanc about 10 years ago, and it seemed to work. I did take a little bit out and blast it, and blend it back in with the rest. It seemed to work.
I've never done it.
Would you do it again, Ben?
No, I wouldn't. It was too much work.
It's not practical.
No.
Did it?
It can be-
I think
it
the other
can
thing
be-
about it too is that
I
it tends
usually
to
don't have the
overflow.
tank space to
Mhm.
give up. I'm usually up to my neck, so I need to buy a few more tanks.
Ditto.
Side too is even on the vineyard side is even when I was talking to John with some stuff is sometimes if you're having too low a pH, we'll sometimes add. We're usually adding potassium just because that's how we get pretty good crops. Grapes take a lot of potassium. We're trying to keep everything balanced. What are your thoughts on that, John?
Potassium's a tool, particularly if you're getting a ripeness issue with a variety that you need to get to a certain Brix and or pH levels. So potassium can be a benefit to that. But again, I think having too much of it in the winery, you can have an issue later on as you get through primary and then malolactic fermentation, and you can get to a higher pH. That's when having blending options is really key. I have found is if you do have a high pH lot, you can typically find a way to blend it away. I've actually had to add acid to my California grapes so that they're not completely throwing out of whack the buffering capacity when I do my blending. So even though I'm getting fruit from the West Coast that can be in that low TA, high pH range, and a lot of Midwest winemakers maybe wouldn't acidulate that, I am acidulating that so that I don't end up with a bigger problem down the line.
And I have a question in the Q&A box that is close to what you were saying, John. When using ML as an acid reducing technique, are you typically putting partial lots through MLF and then blending back, or do you typically put whole lots through MLF?
Anything that sees a barrel for me will go through malolactic. I'll do I actually probably have one of the biggest white barrel programs in the upper Midwest. I'm doing over, let's see, this year it'll be over 1,200 cases worth, 48 barrels worth of whites that have all undergone malolactic fermentation. And so all my reds, they get one lot, they get one type of bacteria, and my whites get a different type of bacteria. So everything that stays in tank for me that goes stainless typically is going to be arrested. So I'm not sending any of that through malolactic. And it's not to say that I won't maybe blend a little something that didn't go through malolactic and is an arrested ferment to use as a potential blending tool. But for the most part, those wines stay the way they are, and very little of it gets blended into malolactic positive.
Yeah, I
And
agree.
I do have another question for you still. So when you blend, let's say, Cabernet Sauvignon with a Marquette, as an example, would you bring the low TA Cabernet into balance before blending high TA Marquette?
No, I'll just blend it. I'll just blend it and make sure to cold stabilize it. Because the one thing you find with adding any vinifera to these cold climate wines, we found out very early on with our biggest red wine, which is a vinifera and cold climate blend. We were getting tartrates on the corks, and we were getting cases sent back to the winery because the consumers didn't understand that it's a natural phenomena. So now we cold stabilize anything in the Frontenac family, particularly that gets blended with anything from vinifera. So all three of those varieties, if they're blended with vinifera, we will make sure that we cold stabilize. But Marquette, we typically don't do a whole lot of cold stabilization with because most of our Marquettes are not blended to excess. And then with our whites, those are all going through cold stabilization anyways. So from a stabilization standpoint, I really only have Frontenac Noir that really is a troublesome one when it comes to cold stabilization and blending.
How long are you barrel aging also? Like with Frontenac Marquettes?
That's a loaded question. It could be 9 months. It could be 20 months, depending on the wine and the price point. Ben would be another one to ask that.
Yeah, my barrel aging is all over the board. It depends on what's in it and how long it's been there and what's been in it before. So for me, sometimes Marquette is as little as 3 months if it's a new barrel. If it's an old one, sometimes it's 18. I pull it out when it tastes like it's done.
Winemaker's favorite answer. All depends.
I have
Is it the same for you, Anne?
Yeah, same as Ben. We don't have very much barrel aging though. And I'll say also that every single one of my wines goes through cold stabilization.
Mine too.
I have a quick question for Jamieson. Jamieson brought up the subject of sparkling wine. I believe that was Jamieson brought that up. Jamieson, you do a lot of mechanical harvesting for hire. That's one of your services. Are there any special considerations for picking, mechanically picking that early fruit? I don't know the answer. I'm asking. I was just imagining, man, maybe sometimes the early picked fruit has a tougher rachis and might not come off the vine as cleanly as ripe fruit. Am I off on a tangent there?
Well, I know that I could get it off, but most of the wineries want to hand pick, which is fine. So a lot of wineries, I know at Chankaska they hand pick, and Josie, I do also vineyard consulting. So it's always when the sparkling people call me and they're like, want everything hand picked, and I'm like, okay, well that grower pool just went a little smaller. But like the growers, like the thing is, it's kind of a hard price point because people want it for sparkling, they want it hand picked. But then also, the hard part is what do you charge for sparkling fruit? Because it costs more because you have to do it hand picked, but then also they're getting to pick it sooner, so they're not, their risk is a little bit lower. Because I know in California, I think, what was it, John might know? I know Mike was saying that too, but I think that the sparkling was you usually got a cheaper price for it because you're not having to hang it out as long. Is that correct?
To some degree, and they'll also crop the vine heavier for sparkling because at that point, because they are getting a cheaper price for the grape, they're looking more from a yield play on that. You're also seeing other varieties in California besides the traditional champagne varieties. And so that also helps drive the price down to some degree on the sparklers. I will say that the sparkling grapes that I have mechanically harvested, I ask that the growers fill the bins shorter so that you don't have as much compaction of the grapes in the bin. So between the vineyard and the winery, you get less juicing up front. So you get less skin contact so that when you do get it into the winery, you can add solids back to your press load and try to get that channeling as much as possible to mimic the whole cluster. But at the end of the day, we're making our press cuts pretty early with sparkling, and so hand harvested really is kind of the way to go on that if you can get it and you can get the economics to work out.
Yeah, I haven't picked, or for the sparkling vineyards that I sell to, I haven't mechanically picked yet. We're usually, it's either they have crews or else we'll send out crews, but it's getting harder to find labor. So I think at some point people are just going to bite the bullet and just do it either way. What, Ben, with your fruit, well, I mean, does it have to be traditional method for doing that? Otherwise, if you're carbonic, or if you're just, if you're doing Champenois method and you're just adding, I don't think it really matters as much. Maybe Ben can expand on that one a little more.
Well, I mean, all I've done right now has been carbonic, so it hasn't mattered too much.
Yeah.
In the champagne method test that I ran was hand harvested.
Okay.
I have one other question for the winemakers. Well, I actually have a few, but I don't know if we'll get to them all. And we are getting towards the end here. I thank you again, participants, for sticking in. This is your last chance if you've got any questions for our panel. Um, for the winemakers, Todd mentioned when he was talking about malolactic fermentation, um, what, and he mentioned whether they use the co-fermentation technique, that is to say, malolactic during primary yeast fermentation, or sequential to do it afterwards. Do any of you winemakers have a preference? And if so, tell us a little bit about it. And if you're willing to share what you think are the best strains of ML bacteria to use on these grapes.
We moved to co-inoculation a couple of years ago, and I'm never going back.
24 hours or 48 hours?
24.
Mhm.
I agree with you, Ann. If I ever go back to commercial winemaking, I'm a big believer in co-fermentation. John and Ben, any thoughts on that?
I make up a starter culture, one white and one red in one early barrel lot, because everything that sees a barrel goes through malolactic. That means I got to top everything because after gross fill, I'm filling 2 gallons short. So I've got to come back and top those barrels anyways. I might as well use a cultured bacteria that's really healthy in one lot. And it's a way for me to make sure that all my barrels do get topped during the harvest period. It's notorious for barrels to go astray that maybe got a partial fill. And so you want to make sure everything gets topped and you don't have any bad barrels. So that's an easy way to get some low-hanging wine health procedures to make sure that your wines are going into the dormancy period, the long winter nap in a good spot. So I like VP41 predominantly for, actually this is a little off kilter. I like it predominantly for whites because I'm not looking for a lot of diacetyl. And then reds, I've used the VP41. I've used, oh God, why can't I think of it? The
Beta?
no, it's the can't think of
R31.
VR31. Yep, and I've used, what's the other one? From Guzmer. I can't think of the manufacturer now.
Gusmer, yeah.
But anyways, I've used a number of different strains for reds and typically don't. I've got enough latent cultured bacteria probably living in all of my barrels in winery right now. I could probably get away with not sending it through. Very early in my career, I was exposed to wild ML, and I don't like to see wild ML in wines that I'm responsible for. So hence I inoculate from a starter culture. Typically, I'll use something vinifera. So that means everything gets a little shot of vinifera that sees a barrel at some point.
And I typically do it sequentially myself, almost as a matter of habit. It's just what I'm used to. And I'm running a little lower pH, so I'm usually forced to use MBR31, and it's worked great this past year. So that's just what I'm used to, though I would like to try co-inoculation and try it out. I just usually am so hectic at harvest, I never want to change what I'm used to.
I can just, go ahead, Todd.
Oh, I think there's positive and negatives of each one. So I think if a winery doesn't have temperature control, in other words, glycol systems that they can control temperature, probably co-inoculation would be a better route to go. We tend to see, again, depends on strain, we tend to see less diacetyl probably produced during that co-inoculation. However, on the flip side, there can be some antagonistic effects. So you really have to pay attention to your yeast and bacteria that you're using, and they're agreeable with each other and don't produce or rob nutrients from the other to stress out yeast and that. So there's benefits on that. Just hanging on the lees too, even if we're doing a sequential, hanging on the lees, as long as the lees are in good shape and good quality, that will help reduce diacetyl also. So, it depends on the winery situation and what individual strains we're using on the benefits of that.
Well, all right.
All right. I don't see any questions, so that's
Right.
your last chance, everyone, for any questions. If you don't want to ask questions right now, you can always send us an email to each of us, and we will answer you and help you. Otherwise, if you don't have anything else to add, I will add something. Hopefully you those tools were helpful for you and you developed the knowledge about how to manage your acidity. And keep in mind that pH is also very important for sulfur dioxide. So to protect your wine, just keep that in mind. So to finish
very
on that
true.
note, what?
Very true.
Yeah.
Very,
And I'll just add that a pH meter works very well when it's in use. If you don't use it, you're getting no information. And I remind starting out or beginning winemakers that fermentation can cause a lot of quick pH shifts that you might not imagine. So have a reliable pH meter, take care of it, calibrate it daily, and use it. And after you've used it, write down the results so you can compare them to the next time. Very, very important. It can't be overstated. I'll let Klodd finish up for us. I just want to thank each of you, Jamieson, Ann, Ben, John, and Annie Klodd, and Todd Steiner. Thank you guys very much for your participation and your time.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. Thank you very much to all our presenters, winemakers, viticulturists, vineyard manager, Drew, my colleague, Todd, Annie, everyone. And so just a few things before closing this webinar. I would like to remind you that you are going to receive an email with a link to complete the Qualtrics survey. So please just take 2 minutes. It shouldn't be that long. That's really just to help us improve our way of offering those webinars to you. And also the next webinar will be on June 28th about wall clusters fermentation. So we're going to talk about stem inclusion and how to use that technique to make wine. Then we will have sparkling wine. So we talk a little bit about sparkling wine today, but we will have a full webinar on July 26th. And then we'll have a break because winemaking will happen. A lot will happen. And then we'll be back in October and November and December. So on that note, thank you very much once again. Thanks, everyone. I hope you enjoyed. I hope you learned a lot and manage your acidity. Good luck, everyone.
thank you, Drew and Ode, everybody.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Have a good day.
Take care, y'all. Thanks again.
Take care.